So roadmap for today. Why bee safe plants? And when I say bee safe plants, that's shorthand for plants that when they leave your nursery and go to someone's house, do not have pesticide residues at levels that are going to potentially be harmful. That's what our goal is. Next step is pollinator stewardship. What is the science telling us, and what are some options that you guys might have in order to get to those bee safe plants? Sharon is going to start at pollinator friendly plant production and kind of go into the solutions, the depth of kind of what it looks like to be pollinator friendly. And then I don't know how many of you grow your own and also sell, but if you're mostly retailers, we're also going to be giving you some questions so that you could talk to your vendors and know what kind of questions you want to ask them. Lori already brought up, she talks to her vendors about neonics. Are there other questions that you want to be asking as you move forward? Really quickly, who is the Nursery Society? We're celebrating 50 years this year. So, and our mission is to protect the life that sustains us. You know, I've also heard people talk about, you know, we're going to protect the little things that run the world. And truly, these invertebrates do run the world. They are our water filtration. They are our pollinators. They help decompose. They are pest managers. And they often go underappreciated for all the amazing things they do to keep us all moving. So that's what our mission is. Sharon and I both work in the pesticide program. I've been part of pesticide reform for more than 20 years and got my master's in environmental health and toxicology way back when in Corvallis, and I see Chouinard's on the screen, and that's where my father-in-law still shops and gets all of his flowers. So it's good to see you on the screen. So I'm having a little trouble moving forward. Not sure. There we go. So why offer bee safe nursery plants? Why take these steps to ask questions of your vendors and make sure that the plants don't have harmful residues? I think obviously one piece of it, the puzzle, is that if we're going to be growing flowers, if we're going to have nursery production, we need our pollinators, right? 85% of flowering plants require some sort of animal to move pollen. Here, around here, that's going to be mostly bees. Absolutely, hummingbirds, butterflies, moths, flies, wasps, all of them are pollinators, but bees are really going to be the main pollinators. And bees are also absolutely, as I mentioned before, bees need you as much as you need them. You see, you know, the nectar that's being provided. This is a picture of a bee balm with a sweat bee on it. That's a huge energy resource for our bees. And the pollen is also extremely important. Bees are actually, you know, there's a lot of pollinators, but bees are the only animals that specifically go collect pollen and bring it back for their young for feeding. So that's another reason that bees are such important pollinators. Most people think about honeybees when they think about bees, and we work a lot on our native bees. So if you look at the bottom here of the screen, you're going to see the nest of a tunnel nesting bee. And the female has actually used mud to create little cells. She went and collected pollen and added a little pollen ball to each one of those cells and laid an egg on top of it. So clearly the pollen in the plants that you are providing them is vitally important for these bees to survive. Unfortunately, it's also in short supply. Not sure why I have a delay. There we go. It's in short supply, but people want we're seeing more and more interest in people getting in pollinator gardening. This is probably old history for you, but the demand for pollinator gardens really comes from other trends around getting native plants in, less maintenance, reduced water, and also we're starting to see a trend towards insect gardens. So the latest trend that we're seeing at Xerces is people are calling us and saying, how do I make sure that the plants I'm buying are not harmful to bees? And we do sometimes get anecdotal, reports of people buying plants and having problems with bees or other pollinators afterwards. We've also actually done some research into collecting residues off of plants to better understand what kind of risks there might be on some of these plants. So the consumer demand is there. Kind of one layer deeper on that, Bee City, you can see that demand when you look at things like Bee City USA and Bee Campus USA, where we've got hundreds of campuses and cities across the country that are actively putting in pollinator gardens. You can look up in, the backyard habitat programs, and you guys know this, people are interested. But, in Portland alone, we've got 6,000 houses in the last decade that have been certified as backyard habitat. This is a great trend, and thank you guys for supplying it. So what does it mean to be stewards of pollinators, and what kind of thoughts should you be bringing to the table when if you want to become stewards for pollinators within your retail agency? So we'll just be honest, the reality is right now, currently, there are a number of pesticides being used in nursery production. And this is to a great extent driven by our customers, right? These are customers who want things to be aesthetic. And that means sometimes pesticides are used even when the plant's health is not compromised, but because of the drive of the customers. Added to that, we've got interstate commerce. We've got quarantines. All these things are promoting pesticide uses, sometimes that can be harmful to our pollinators. So we're thinking about that we have these pesticide uses exist, right? And let's take a step back and think about how might bees be exposed to these various pesticide uses. And I go into this because our native bees aren't that similar to honeybees. And so people aren't always thinking about the various potential exposure routes that you might see for our native bees. Most everyone's thinking about, you don't want to spray a bee that's on a plant, right? That's pretty obvious. That's the most obvious exposure route we're going to see. The next one is bees also might visit a flower where a plant was already sprayed and there's residue left over. Hours later, if you did a night application, those residues still might be toxic, maybe sometimes even days later. Something else to think about is our native bees actually collect leaves to line their nests. So if we've sprayed a plant, even if it's not in bloom, and you've got bees that are using that material for their nest, there's a potential for exposure. Then there's a whole bunch of our native bees. 70% of our native bees live in the ground. So the increase in soil drench or other types of applications that might drip and move onto the ground could potentially expose our native bees. And native bees are actually, there's going to be some life stage underground at all times. I mentioned soil drench. That's mostly using systemic insecticides or other systemic chemicals. And those systemic chemicals have one other issue. It might be hidden by image on the side, but the final one is the uptake of systemic pesticides into plants, into their leaves, their pollen, and their nectar. You guys have probably all heard this. But neonicotinoids and other systemic insecticides can be expressed in pollen and nectar, giving a direct exposure route. Something else I quickly want to mention with this is a lot of butterflies, they have host plants. And if a host plant has been treated, the leaves could also be toxic and that caterpillar could also be exposed. So just another aside on potential exposure routes. So if we're looking at a backyard garden and someone using pesticides, any of these exposure routes are possible. If we're looking in nursery production with applications, any of these exposure routes are possible, especially if we're looking at outdoor field nurseries. But if we're looking at what you are selling to your customers, it's just these final four where you might potentially see what you're selling to a customer could potentially have, these exposure routes could possibly still happen. The science backs this up. And I just really want to be clear that this is really just background. This is not a judgment. This is a reality that we're in. And Sharon has worked with nurseries for years and understands the many issues that are related to pesticide use within our nurseries. But the science is showing that when nursery plants are tested, oftentimes they have multiple pesticides on them, sometimes at levels that could actually kill bees. Pesticides applied during bloom are especially concerning. That's not just at night when bees are foraging, that's bloom, because you can also have pollen that can have high levels of pesticides. Applications of systemics sometimes can still be on those plants and residues being found weeks after that application. And a really interesting one that we're seeing more and more is that woody plants, shrubs and trees can express systemic pesticides months to years after an application. And this is really important because, you know, that plum tree in early spring is a mass flowering plant that's super important for those bees, especially those early arriving bees that are going to be, aren't going to have many other floral resources available. So we're actually looking at an application that might have happened in August of one year, still expressing toxic levels in the blooms the following summer. Lori mentioned it. I bet a lot of you are already on this track. You guys are aware of this and you're taking steps. You know, the neonic free is probably the most obvious action that people are taking, and you can see policies outside. When people look at for plants, they're going to see policies around going neonic free or other neonic reduced type policies that are out there. And what we want to today, and what Sharon's going to dive into much deeper than I have, she's going to start talking about what other steps need to be taken. Going neonic free is a great first step, but just like the woman who was talking about Roundup earlier, you go to Roundup free, there's just going to be an alternative that someone is going to put in place. So just kind of removing one chemical isn't really a true solution. And what we've seen with the neonicotinoids is there are newer other systemic insecticides that also potentially are showing the same kinds of concerns. They're highly toxic, they're long-lived, they're systemic. We might just be trading one problem for another. So what we're hoping, kind of moving into that next step, is we're really hoping that we can think a little deeper about what are pollinator attractive plants. How do we make them more pollinator friendly? Bringing in the consumer to know, and the retailers to know what are ecologically sound practices. What are the more diverse set of options that can be done at a nursery in order to reduce pesticide use and reduce risk to our pollinators? And I think we're looking at something it's going to be slow, it's not easy, it's a dialogue, it's going to require trust and patience and listening, all the things that you guys were talking about. But I think that if we can move this forward, if we can get our consumers, our retailers to better understand what it means to truly be pollinator friendly, we absolutely can be making our pollinator attractive plants a lot healthier for our bees. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Sharon. I did mention she has a long history working on pesticide reform, working in land management. She has worked with nurseries, with contract and wholesale nurseries looking for alternative pest management practices in order to reduce pesticide use. So I'm really excited to have her join us, and I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to her.
Thanks, Ame. I'm Sharon Salvaggio, as Ame just mentioned, and I'm really happy to be here. And I do recognize some of you from conversations in the past at your nurseries, so it's pretty cool to be here. And thank you so much for having us. I'm going to share my screen, but while I do that, I just want you to know that I just posted a link to a new fact sheet that we've just produced in the chat. You don't have to look at it now, and you probably received it earlier, but it will echo a lot of what I am going to be talking about. And I just wanted it to be there for you as I proceed. And feel free to take time to look at it afterwards, or if you've got it with you now. So I'm just starting my video, I noticed. And so, are you seeing my slides right now?
Yeah, but it's not the slideshow.
Okay, so I'm having a hard time pulling my window. Okay, let me see. There we go. Slideshow from current slide. Okay, great. Are you seeing the slideshow now?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. Well, I am going to click through all of Ame's slides here and get to my first slide. Okay, so Let's talk about pollinator-friendly production, specifically with regard to pest management practices. Now, it's not possible really to 100% guarantee safety for pollinators, but there is a lot that can be done to reduce the likelihood that pollinators would be harmed by pest management practices. But what do those look like on the ground and in the greenhouse? And how can you, as a nursery buyer, find out if the nursery that you source from is using pollinator-friendly practices? So pollinator-friendly pest management really boils down to implementation of 3 simple principles: preventing pests using non-chemical methods, monitoring pest pressure, sometimes called scouting, and limiting pesticide harm if pesticides are used as a last resort. We call these 3 principles the 3-legged stool of pollinator-friendly management. And together, they, whoops, excuse me. I clicked twice and it went back. Together, they really help to reduce risk to pollinators and ensure that plant producers reduce their reliance on harmful pesticides as well. So let's go through these in some detail, starting with prevention. Prevention is the most important tactic in pollinator-friendly growing. It's the first line of defense against pests. Prevention tactics keep pests from becoming a problem in the first place. And therefore, prevention is arguably the most effective and the least costly way to approach pest management. Just as you wash your hands to prevent the transmission of disease, nurseries have a lot of tools in their toolbox to prevent pest outbreaks. A smart prevention tactic that all of you as plant people are well aware of already is keeping plants healthy by giving them the basics they need to thrive, such as the right amount of space, water, and ventilation, the right temperatures and light, and healthy soil. And the idea, of course, is to help plants outgrow any pests that may arrive. It's like good sleep, good food, and regular exercise for people. And I know you all know about this very well from your own experience as nursery people. There is actually good scientific evidence, too, that weak plants are more likely to succumb to disease or insect pressure. Even more intriguingly, some stress plants emit chemicals that attract pests. We see this, for example, with maples and ambrosia beetles. That's a serious pest of maple trees. So giving plants those basics that they need to thrive is important. This slide covers other effective prevention tactics. For example, disinfecting surfaces helps prevent the spread of diseases. On the far left, we see a photo of a foot bath set out for employees to use before entering plant zones at hedgerow farms in California. The foot bath contains a disinfectant that kills off Phytophthora spores on their boots. As many of you, of course, know, Phytophthora is a serious disease on the West Coast, and between this technique and appropriate drainage, hedgerow farms has kept the disease at bay. Another example is isolating any incoming stock, such as liners that come in from propagation nurseries. This is a quarantine, essentially, and we're all very familiar with that now. Keeping new stock separate from the rest of the inventory for a week or 2 will give the nursery time to inspect it and determine if it's harboring any diseases or pests while not allowing it to spread to the rest of the nursery inventory. Onto the third photo, we're showing a flame maple here. Diseases and insect pests can be avoided more easily with the use of cultivars that have been selected or bred to be resistant. This is one of the easiest ways to prevent pests. This photo shows a flame maple variety, which is resistant to a common borer species in maples called the flat-headed apple tree borer. Of course, in some instances, such as production of native plants for restoration, growing cultivars may be incompatible. Yet another prevention tactic is called exclusion. For example, this nursery in Florida is protected by a very fine mesh screen, and you can see the tiny whitefly perched on the screen just above the finger of the extension agent who took the photo. And because of that screen, the whitefly can't get in. So this slide shows another set of prevention approaches based in biological principles, the way nature approaches pest control. For example, on the left, we show an open air nursery in Vermont. Screening obviously cannot be used in open air settings, but a different effective tactic can. Notice the white alyssum plants in hanging baskets above the nursery crop. Those are there to attract native insect predators. Alyssum is so effective at attracting predators like hoverflies that in organic lettuce fields, researchers have figured out that you only need about 2% of the field planted in alyssum to get effective management of aphids and of thrips. Hoverflies look a lot like bees, and they're pretty easy to spot in gardens too. The next example shown here is a marigold, which is being used as a trap crop. Note that it's sitting next to a bunch of small pots of an ornamental being grown for sale. This trap plant technique is used by Iwasaki Brothers Nursery in Oregon. Marigold is really attractive to thrips, and so it serves as a trap for these tiny pests, helping to keep them on the marigold instead of on the ornamental starts. It's kind of like when all the boys at the prom zero in on the prettiest girl in the room. On the right, we show a pheromone lure being used here to mess with oriental beetles. Now, Pinelands Nursery in New Jersey uses this technique. Pheromones can fool and confuse insects, preventing mating. These are just a few examples of hundreds of non-toxic prevention techniques that are available and being used across the country. It's a good time to emphasize that when we talk about prevention, we're talking about non-chemical management only. So how can you tell if a nursery has a good prevention program? Well, multiple tactics is one thing to look for. A nursery that's really committed to prevention should be able to give you numerous examples of non-chemical management that they do to prevent pests and limit their spread. For example, they may remove diseased plants as soon as they're spotted. They may add compost to every pot to keep the microbial balance of the soil at its best. They may hand pick and destroy pupae or larvae of certain pest insects. No matter what the technique is, listen for the use of several. Second, the techniques used should demonstrate a clear strategic purpose. In other words, a link to either plant health or pest suppression. For example, in an outdoor nursery, a pest that likes high humidity may be staved off by timely pruning and orientation of the crop to the wind. A nursery thinking strategically about managing a difficult pest learns about what the pest needs to live, its food, the amount of water it needs, its habitat, and reduces those. Third, the techniques should be informed by science. Now, you know that university cooperative extension offices across the country help growers with scientifically based management recommendations. Of course, science done right can originate right in the nursery, and those who experiment are often the most observant and innovative growers, paving the way for others. Either way, prevention actions should be scientifically informed. Finally, and critically, non-chemical prevention methods should be used first and always before pesticides are used. Let's go to the second leg of our three-legged stool now. Monitoring or scouting is being alert to and actively on the lookout for pest populations so that increases are quickly noted and dealt with. Scouting can be about looking for the pest itself and tabulating the pressure. For instance, by comparing counts of pest insects week by week. Sticky cards, shown here on the top left, intercept flying individuals and a nice tool to compare counts week by week. For insects that are not flying, closely inspecting the preferred pest locations, such as the underside of leaves, is another method. In either case, a tool that allows magnification, such as a hand lens or a head-mounted lens like an optivisor, is an important tool. On the bottom left, I show an innovative method, again being used by Iwasaki Brothers Nursery in Oregon. This nursery uses young eggplants as an indicator plant next to the crop. The eggplant preferentially attracts certain pests so that it gives an early warning of pest buildup. Other ways to monitor include looking for symptoms on the plant itself, such as characteristic damage signs on leaves. Diagnostic labs that specialize in identification are really important helpmates. especially for diseases which are often difficult for a non-specialist to identify. Whatever the method, monitoring is about tracking the location, the size, and the severity of any problems. Meticulous attention to scouting allows nurseries to detect signs of an impending pest outbreak and is a critical step because when detected early, pests can often be managed more effectively and safely. For example, if disease is caught early on, infected plants can be removed or damaged areas cut off and disposed of. And then the nursery can also rethink its prevention protocols to see what might have caused the disease in the first place. Let's look at indicators of a good scouting program. I know we're getting into a little bit of detail here, but I hope it's really useful for you as you use this information to talk to your suppliers and get more detail from them. The more you know about good practices, the easier it will be for you to assess the practices of your suppliers. So indicators of a good scouting program include, first, regularly scheduled. This often means weekly, especially during the growing season. And then using established protocols. This means that standardized procedures have been set up and are followed. And this makes results comparable from week to week, giving a more reliable estimate of pressure. For example, the scout might select 10 plants to survey per house and counts the number of whiteflies on one leaf per plant. Keeping written records is really important too. Without written records, a nursery would have to rely on someone with a very good memory to track changes over time and assess the effectiveness of interventions. I know that that's not what I have. Maybe some people out there do, but written records are really helpful. Now, monitoring and scouting is a task that requires skill. I was told by a consultant not so long ago who works exclusively with the nursery industry that the scouting job often falls to those lowest on the totem pole. I was actually shocked to hear this, and I thought it was a big mistake. The person or people doing this job should be carefully trained, and their level of skill should be established by their supervisor. They need to recognize the pest species and their different life stages, as well as any beneficials that might be conducting natural pest management. And diagnostic labs should be used where necessary. Finally, scouting is only really worth the time if it informs the intervention decisions. So scouting should be used to determine whether any intervention is actually needed according to predetermined action thresholds. We realize that action thresholds are not very common in ornamental plant production and that cosmetic injury drives a lot of pesticide treatment. Still, when scouting is done regularly and carefully, interventions such as pesticide treatments may be able to be kept to a smaller scale. So we just talked about prevention and monitoring. Remember, those come first. And if prevention and monitoring are priorities, given the attention and the funding that they need, pesticides should be an ever decreasing part of the pest management, a last resort, not a first line of defense. But if a nursery does use pesticides, it's important to look into what is used, when it is used, and how it's used, how they are used, I should say. So ask, what is used? We recommend that if pesticides are used, nurseries select organic or less toxic choices. Organic allowed pesticides are generally lower risk than their conventional counterparts and can be identified by the OMRI logo on the label. We also recommend that no neonics or similar insecticides be used. We recommend that you ask about when they're used. Does the nursery avoid routine pesticide applications? Sometimes you'll hear nursery staff talk about calendar sprays or preventative treatments. Those practices indicate that a nursery could be applying pesticides without monitoring. In other words, applying without really knowing what their pest pressure is. Another time-related aspect is whether pesticides are used during bloom time and how close to plant sale insecticides are used. Both of these are red flags. Any application during bloom can be a problem. And generally, the longer the period of no pesticide use before sale, the better. Based on the science, if pesticides are used, ask if the nursery observes a practice of no insecticides at least 4 weeks before sale, even if the plant is not blooming. This no treatment window helps to reduce the potential harmful exposures from surface contamination to leaves and soil. And for systemic insecticides, this provision helps allow for some breakdown of the chemical before the plant is outplanted. Finally, it's important to ask how the pesticide is used. Are nurseries using blanket applications applying to everything, or are they only using pesticides on the affected plants? Also, do they routinely use tank mixes, which is multiple pesticides at one time? This can be risky for bees, sometimes multiplying the impact. So there are a number of ways to limit the harm of pesticides. Still, bottom line, everything that I've talked about here on this slide is what we call an end of the hose fix, not the primary way to grow pollinator friendly. We firmly believe that it's important for nurseries to reduce their overall reliance on pesticides, not simply implement end of the hose solutions. So we mentioned recommending no neonics, and there's a ton of research showing that the 4 neonics listed here are harmful to bees and a wide range of other insects. So we consider the science pretty well established on that. We also have a number of studies showing neonics present in nursery plants at retail and commercial production outlets across the country at dangerous levels. And while it appears that many wholesalers have started to move away from use of neonics, they are still out there. So ask your vendors for plants grown without neonics. It's important to ask because despite widespread reports that most wholesalers are growing neonic free, only a few nurseries who are growing neonic free actually state that on the product label or their websites. You can see this label from Blooming Nursery in Oregon, which clearly states neonic free on the bottom. We also mentioned to avoid similar insecticides. And we say this because the use of other insecticides to manage common nursery pests is on the rise. Many of these chemicals are newly registered and lack a robust set of independent studies to assess their risk to pollinators. And we're concerned about some of these new insecticides, which are similar to neonics in terms of their toxicity and persistence. 2 in particular that concern us are the insecticides flopyrodifurone, also called Altus, and cyantraniliprole, also known as mainspring. Both of these are used in the nursery industry. We could have included a number of other insecticides and fungicides that we're also concerned about, but for now, these 2 have risen to the top. So we advise you to consider these pesticides when sourcing plants. So what exactly is our concern about these chemicals? Let's look at cyantraniliprole and mainspring first. Well, we have quite a few concerns, not all of which are captured here, but this is a short summary. First, this pesticide is systemic, highly toxic to bees, and persistent, which means it kills bees at low concentrations. Highly toxic means that it kills bees at low concentrations, and it's also quite persistent. Studies also show potential for high residues in pollen, especially in woody species. The rates that are available to nurseries were never studied prior to registration in the US. And we lack data on concentrations that harm but don't kill, also called sublethal effects. The label also prohibits applications on plants in bloom, but there are several exceptions or loopholes on the label that make this ineffective. And with flopyrodifurone, the other chemical that we recommend that you avoid, again, we have a number of concerns, not all captured here, but this is a short summary. Again, this chemical is systemic, highly toxic to adult bees when consumed, and quite persistent. Now, annual and woody plants treated with bloom time foliar applications at rates available for nurseries show risky pollen residue levels, and newer studies have uncovered a variety of sublethal effects at low concentrations. We also have seen evidence of synergistic effects with fungicides and if bees are infected with Nosema. In sum, we urge great precaution with both of these chemicals and ask that you consider use of these 2 insecticides when sourcing plants. If manufacturers can answer these important questions that we have and show the lack of risk over time, that would be great. For now, we recommend caution, and we advise growers to avoid use of we advise buyers to avoid sourcing plants grown with excuse me, even I can stumble over these words, fluopyrodifurone or cyantraniliprole when possible. So let's move to the last section, talking to your vendors. Now, we've covered a lot of material. So if your head is spinning, please know that we've got a guide for you that you can refer back to. And that's what I put pasted into the chat a little bit earlier. We've summarized our recommendations and questions to ask your suppliers in this new fact sheet, offering Be Safe Plants, a guide for nurseries. And Carrie, I believe, distributed it to you also before the webinar. This fact sheet is meant for you as plant buyers to use to evaluate the practices of your suppliers and for use by production nurseries to conduct self-assessments of their own practices. The guide reminds retailers and growers that one integrative way to practice pollinator-friendly pest management that incorporates all of our suggestions about prevention, monitoring, and limiting pesticide harm is to grow and offer plants that are certified organic. Offering certified organic plants signals pollinator-friendly production. Not only are organic growers required to conserve biodiversity, but the organic standards also require pest prevention practices and prohibit the use of most synthetic pesticides. The allowed pesticides under the organic standards are generally lower risk than their conventional counterparts. And while organic ornamental and landscape plants can be difficult to find, we know there is growing interest. So by asking your suppliers for organic or searching out those organic growers, you'll be signaling your interest in increasing demand, ultimately resulting in an increased supply. The publication offers questions that you can ask about prevention, and it includes specific questions to ask about monitoring and scouting. And it includes questions to ask about pesticide use with the goal of limiting pesticide harm. Now, I'm not going to go over all these because I went over a lot of them before in the principles, but to sum up, we truly hope that this guide is useful to you and helps you provide some certainty about offering Be Safe plants for your customers. We hope that you can use the guide to better understand the pest management practices of your suppliers. And this guide could also be used to develop a purchasing policy that would require that your vendors demonstrate prevention, monitoring, and measures to limit pesticide harm. So if you'd like to distribute this fact sheet to other nurseries or share information with your customers, please let us know on the evaluation form and we can send materials to you. In developing this material, we've been reviewing a lot of information from Extension, the Horticultural Research Institute, and talking to extension scientists, research scientists, and a number of different nurseries about their practices. So we always learn from each conversation that we have with people in the nursery industry. And if you have thoughts on this work or want to reach out, we do have a little bit of time for questions now, but if we don't have enough time and you have additional questions or thoughts, we welcome that. I've put our email, which is pesticides@nurseries.org, on this slide. And our phone numbers are also at our website. So thank you so much for having us today. We are a donor-supported nonprofit, and we thank our donors for supporting this work. We have a few minutes for questions and answers right now before Laura Vollmer's presentation next.
And there were a couple of questions in the chat that I also answered as well.
Okay.
So.
Thank you, Sharon and Ame. There were a couple of questions, but I think those were fairly well answered. There is one from Lynn Holmes. Did you see that one?
I just saw it pop in.
Okay.
So imidacloprid is a neonicotinoid, and we would definitely advise against that use on a household plant. It was interesting today to be thinking about you as our audience instead of often the consumers that are our audience when they want something quick and simple and easy, like don't use neonics, don't buy plants that have neonicotinoids. And then thinking about you guys see the more nuanced issues. When might Roundup be something that's going to be used? And when is it something we don't want to be using and when we want to avoid it? And when can we avoid it? But yet for household use, I can see no reason when you would want to use a neonicotinoid of any on a household plant, even if you might lose that plant. You know, there are times when Xerces has looked at backyard trees that we don't have an option, and you're looking at a really severe pest and a loss of that tree. And then we ask people to think really strongly about what their values are with that tree and the risks they might be using versus the loss of that tree. But with a household plant, I don't think I can see why you'd use a neonic. And the question that was in the chat was about another Marathon, which is a neonicotinoid, and its use. And same kind of idea. Why, is this really the right choice? But if I'm missing something, if there's more to that question, let me know.
That's all I see in the chat. And I think at this point we'll move forward with Lori. Thank you, both of you. It was a very, very good presentation, very interesting and good information. Fairly presented, I think, as well. And if anyone has additional questions, I'm sure they can get a hold of you from the contact information. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank
So,
you.
Lori, if you want to go ahead and jump in.
Okay. See if I can get this puppy going. We all good? Everybody?
Looks good here.
Okay, great. So yes, thank you, Ome and Sharon. You've done a super job explaining why this trend is important to nursery owners and actually the whole world, and also acknowledging that there's many of our nurseries in the NNBA that are already focusing on this trend and are very aware of all the good stuff it's doing. So how do we save the insects that support the plant world and benefit our businesses at the same time? Supporting the pollinator network in an urban setting and helping to increase pollinator food sources is an easy way for people or customers to understand how they can contribute. And that is the gardening trend that we're talking about. If we take advantage of this trend, we can educate and guide our customers to be successful gardeners and also help them to contribute. The pollinator trend has been an opportunity for nurseries for a number of years. Many of us are already doing something around the subject of pollinators, but if you're only dabbling in it, I'm hoping to inspire you to make pollinator habitat as important a selling point for your customers as low maintenance and winter bloom is. Pollinator attractor, pollinator friendly, these terms can be strong selling points actually, and they are good to influence a customer's, can actually influence a customer's final decision on a plant. As retailers, we have the ability to coax our customers into habits that will benefit them today and also in the future. So if you choose to be a pollinator gardening influencer, here's a few ways to do it in your nursery and on your websites and of course on your Instagram feeds. Some NNBA members are actually doing big activities around this, and then some are doing subtle things, but they're still very influential. The first person I reached out to for info on what's happening in their nursery is Jenny Gunderson from My Garden Nursery. And Jenny responded, as for the retail pollinator trend, I'm afraid we've not really promoted it. We do sell mason bees and we have displays with bee-friendly plants. We sell organics and we sell plants from F&B and others that do not use imidacloprid. We also coach customers about when to spray, which was mentioned earlier. That's really important. I think Jenny is actually doing more than she thinks because it's the subtle messages that we use to influence people that really help them to make good choices. Little bits of information that can slowly change their gardening habits. Carrying organic soil and organic cats is another way of communicating the benefits of gardening without pesticides. It's very subtle. All it is a big sign on that bag that says organics, but it's still influential. And as was mentioned earlier, organic products help to support pollinators. Another way to communicate the importance of pollinators in the garden is to show your customers how insects are a natural part of the yard. Bees and butterflies and other invertebrates are intrinsic to the garden. Their presence and participation in nature is how nature works and how it survives. Events and lectures on native pollinators and plants naturally tie in with the other products we sell. It's the difference between having a sale on perennials and saying it's National Pollinator Week, so take advantage of our perennial sale. So you've subtly moved in that subject of pollinators and kind of got that focused on habitat. This is an event where we participated and partnered with Beyond Toxics at our nursery. They were a great supporter in doing kids activities and casual question and answer sections, stations out in the nursery, and educating about pollinator habitat and gardening. A really super easy addition to what you're already doing is adding links to your websites for information about plants and insects. A few more, some of these sites were mentioned earlier. This encourages customers to use your site as a source of information as well as for stuff to buy. So every time they visit your site for possibly even just information, it's added exposure to your nursery. Speaking of educating your customers, Cornell Farms has actually hired a budding entomologist. This is Fiona, and she's a pollinator expert in their nursery. This is pretty impressive to me. She's educating customers about why insects, bugs, and all the rest are important to their lives and how they fit in naturally. She's doing blogs and obviously Instagram posts. And also, you might want to think of your pollinator end caps and tables as not just a special area for a focused message about the kind of plant, but also as a way of featuring plants that come in new shipments. Perhaps even it's a plant that's in your perennial section, that it's in its prime and it's just not moving. This is a great way to feature it, but also give it some added value. Again, with Cornell Farms, they've done a great job of communicating what plants for pollinators actually do by calling their featured area the Pollinator Buffet. This merchandising space has grown for them over the years. It's now 2 full tables. They've improved their signage 2 years ago and added natives to that mix, which is also really important. And they're hoping to incorporate shrubs soon. I see that this might be a whole department for them someday. This display is up all year long, so it's not something that's like a flash in the pan in the spring section. So how do we talk to customers about pollinator plants? There were some suggestions earlier about how to control insects that we might even incorporate in our nurseries. Putting some alyssum near some plants with a little sign that actually says, why is this alyssum over here with this heuchera, etc. So Debbie from Cornell Farms put it this way. It's not that different. It's not that different than talking about wet plants, dry plants, but a timelier way of focusing because of the general concern on climate change and the health of our ecosystem. People coming to a garden store are looking for this type of product. We need to do a good job of showing them what protects and the products that fill their needs to protect pollinators. Some customers don't know the terminology to ask for plants without neonics or other things that are harmful to insects and birds. But if they ask about plants for pollinators, they assume they are asking for something that supports them and in turn supports the ecosystem and supporting pollinators. So we want to make sure that we have plants available that are free from chemicals that can fit this bill. We're really important to this issue, as Sharon and Ame talked about, because we have the ability to guide people's shopping habits. How we influence people becomes our legacy to our communities. So what would you like your retail legacy to be? You're in charge of that. We all want to make our customers happy. But do you want to make your customers happy for today or give them information and products that will benefit them for a lifetime? And I hope the latter. If you have, that was a lot of pretty pictures, and I hope some of those suggestions were good for you. And if you have any questions, of course, I'd be happy to answer those. See if I can get my stop sharing.
I really appreciate all of the nurseries that are already doing things and what they're doing. The examples that you showed, it's wonderful. I do think that we have to be the leaders in education to the masses. That's my position.
Cool. That's great to hear. And thanks for all you're doing too.
And you.
I'm trying to stop my share, but I've lost my cursor.
Usually if you move your mouse clear to the top, Lori.
All right.
Thank you, Lori and Debbie. What you guys are doing is inspiring me.
Great. I may have to just sign out eventually, John.
You can use Carrie's method. Just click the mouse about 50 times all over the place. That usually works.
I'm all over the place. Stop sharing. Oh, there's that part. Okay.
There you go.
I just stopped you, sorry.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, there's a couple of questions in the chat that maybe didn't get answered. Is there a list of good guy insects? I see that. And there's another question about pesticide certified for organic garden. What are some people using? So maybe a list of those. So if anybody has a source for a fact sheet or something like that, maybe that would be helpful.
We don't currently have a list like that, but I think we should do one. So I'll get that together and maybe I can use the folks at Nurseries to help me put that together too. We'll get it out to everybody.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in really quickly on that. And John, am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Sure, I'm easy. Yeah.
Oh, okay. You know, there's a lot of what we call beneficial insects that do different functions, and you kind of included bees and moths, which we often think of as pollinators, but there's also beneficial insects that conduct natural pest control, a whole bunch of predatory insects, parasitic wasps, and so on. We have some really great webinars on those and some books and other resources about that. I don't know if we have a single list, but maybe the best thing for me to do is to send through Carrie a few links afterwards, and we can kind of refer you to some more information about those.
Sounds good.
Okay.
There was another handout that I'm not sure if it went out to everybody, but it's a handout that was developed by Glenn Andresen, who comes in and does lectures for us. And it was a great chart about different plants, flowering plants, and when they bloom and create habitat, and then also what insects they support and butterflies and things like that. So I'm hoping that went out.
Carrie said that did go out.
Question.
Go ahead, John. I
Oh,
think
hey,
that was John.
for Lori or Debbie. So what is a pollinator friendly plant? I mean, besides something that just blooms, does it have a certain amount of nectar? Does it have a certain amount of pollen? What really makes a pollinator friendly plant, and what isn't such a plant? Just curious.
Well, I was just going to say quickly, Debbie, pollinator friendly started for us with plants that don't have chemicals in them that are going to harm pollinators. If it's friendly to pollinators, that means it's not going to kill them, I guess. So, and then the other thing is the difference between pollinator friendly, which is pollinator protective. There's also pollinator attractor, and that would be a message about this is going to be something that's valuable in your pollinator habitat that you're trying to create. Now, as far as how much pollen and all that, I haven't a clue. I do think that the chart that links certain types of invertebrates to certain types of plants is valuable. But what about you, Debbie? You need to unmute.
Yeah, I mean, similar to you is how we started, but I do know there is a much higher pollen count for certain types of plants, especially natives. That's when we realized a year or so ago that we should definitely be including natives in our collection. And also the importance of having it year round for all the insects that need it year round. But I would love to hear Sharon talk about specific, if there is a list of high pollinator plants, and maybe that's what Glenn's list is, I don't know.
Yeah, I would agree with both of those responses, and then also add that, like Lori mentioned, we differentiate pollinator attractive from pollinator friendly. You know, in my presentation and in our presentation with MA, we tried to expand upon those concepts of what pollinator friendly pest management would look like. And it goes beyond just avoiding a certain set of chemicals, but it includes this prevention, the monitoring, and the limiting pesticide harm a little bit more broadly. In terms of those plants that are pollinator attractive, there's a few things to keep in mind. One is kind of like Debbie said, natives can be really, really important, not just because the local bees and butterflies have co-evolved with, you know, those plants. But some of those species have very tight relationships, you know, especially some of the butterflies. They require only sometimes a couple of species as host plants. And so without those, they can't complete their reproductive cycle. And so the second thing is that you may know of Gail Longeletto. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, unfortunately, but she's been doing some really interesting work to try to measure in gardens the degree of pollinator visitation on different garden plants, both native and non-native. And so she's been amassing a bunch of data in and around Western Oregon, I think primarily in Portland, over the last 5 years or so. And there's also an effort out of Rutgers University to do that for more broadly for nursery plants across the country. And so there are some sources beyond the anecdotal sort of thing that we all know that lavenders are really pollinator attractive and so on. You know, ongoing research projects to try to quantify the degree of pollinator attractiveness of a bunch of different plants. We do have lists at our website of plants that are particularly pollinator attractive in our Pollinator Conservation Resource Center. So if you go to our website and go to the Pollinator Conservation tab, you'll end up eventually finding that.
All right, so I was talking, but of course I had muted myself, so I was just talking to myself. Now I think we are good. I think that's all the questions I see in the chat, but I wanted to come back to two things that I wanted to kind of discuss. Was one, Sharon, do you make a distinction in plants? We have honeybees, we have native bees, and commercial orchards rely very, very heavily on honeybees, but home gardeners and so on, I think probably the natives are equally or even more important. Do you make a distinction in plants that attract one or the other is in what you're doing?
I would say that when you look at Xerces publications, you would be finding plants that are attractive to native bees and other native pollinators, because we're about the conservation of native species.
Right.
We do pay attention to information about the honeybee because they are an important non-native pollinator. And of course, when it comes to the pesticide world, almost all the studies that we have available are conducted on honeybees. But from a conservation standpoint and from a standpoint of gardening, planting plants in order to specifically assist pollinators, we're always focused on those native species.
Mm.
One other thing I forgot to mention that is an important thing to recognize, and I first learned this from Monrovia Nursery, the integrated pest manager there, when I was kind of new to this whole work. And he told me that, and I recognized, the truth of this through many other sources later, but those natural organisms that provide natural pest control that I talked about, the predators and the parasitic wasps and a number of other species, well, they usually need pollen and nectar too during a portion of their life stage. So by providing flowering plants that have good sources of pollen and nectar, and particularly in providing the diversity, someone mentioned that, like, that bloom in different seasons, that have different flower types, and so on and so forth. You're not only supporting what the important pollinators that we think of, the bees and the butterflies, but you're also actually providing food sources for those beneficial natural pest control organisms that are really important in our ecosystem.
Okay, thank you. The other comment I had, or kind of semi question, was alyssum, the use of that in the garden and so on. I put in a small orchard last spring, so this will be my second leaf, and one of the most of my experiences with commercial apple orchards, and one of the recommendations, which kind of shocked me, in the commercial trade papers was to use alyssum a lot within the row as an attractant for a number of different insects. And then to see that in your presentation, it kind of, we had a beautiful orchard because it bloomed all summer as this beautiful alyssum, and everybody was admiring my alyssum, but there was a purpose behind it. So um, can you maybe touch on that just a little bit in use of maybe home vegetable gardens? Is that something that should be used?
Well, there's research on a number of different kind of important plants that is kind of illuminating, and alyssum is one of those plants that has a pretty good research base and some pretty interesting results that show how attractive it is, to things like hoverflies that can then prey upon those aphids and thrips. So there are many other plants. A colleague of mine just did a really interesting presentation about other plants that are also really good for both pollinators and natural pest control. And she talked about buckwheat, she talked about sunflowers, she talked about a lot of other species. So again, I can send the link to that.
That'd be interesting.
And it's a little bit, I mean, it's really interesting to look at some of those plants and recognize that there are some, kind of like super plants, like we might talk about superfoods, but then also knowing that that might almost be an illusion sometimes because maybe we only have research on a few plants. And so we want to be a little bit careful about saying, oh my God, you'll solve all your problems if you just plant alyssum and sunflowers. It's really more important to have a diversity of plants, especially natives, but there is some really good research behind the effectiveness of species like alyssum for pest control.
Okay. Yeah, I was just interested in, you think of, okay, I'm going to plant a vegetable garden, so you plant a vegetable garden, but integrating other plants that not necessarily food plants for other reasons within that, I think is a concept that deserves a little bit of study.
Yeah, there are some nurseries that produce, packets of insectary seeds here in the Northwest. I'm forgetting the guy's name, but he had a nursery down in Philomath who was producing insectary packets, and I'm sure that there's a bunch of others. But it's kind of interesting to look at those insectary plants. There's calendula, there's what I started to notice just through my own gardening, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen this too, is that a lot of the herbaceous plants that come from Europe that, we all often include in our vegetable gardens, the dill and the fennel and the basil and so on, a lot of those, and lavender, they can be really, really attractive to a lot of those beneficial insects and a lot of small native bees. And I'm not a great entomologist, so, but what I do see is just the huge amount of insect life that is congregating on them. And what I've read from people who can identify these species better than I can is that they are actually really, really important insectary plants. So there are a number of different species, but those herbaceous, those herbs that we think of as garden herbs are another really good set.